Good morning. You're all very welcome to another Signpost Series webinar. My name is Cathal Somers, and you're very welcome to another presentation this week. I hope you're all keeping well and looking forward to an excellent presentation coming up. We're delighted to be joined this morning by Teagasc Senior Research Officer, Dr. Lorraine Balaine, working in the Agricultural Economics and Farm Service Department, Rural Economy and Development Programme. Lorraine, good morning.
Good morning, Cathal, and good
How are
morning,
you keeping
everybody.
today?
Yeah, a little bit wet outside and internet cut off there about 10 minutes ago, so hopefully it will all go well under the
Yeah,
storm.
strange weather. Where are you based today, Lorraine?
I'm actually at home because the traveling was not very safe, so I'm close to Athlone, but I'm normally based in Teagasc, Cathan.
Lovely, lovely. And we're also joined by Teagasc Catchment Co-ordinator for the Boyne, Fiona Doolan, who's going to help me out with questions this morning. How are you, Fiona?
Morning, Cathal. Morning, Lorraine.
Yeah. How are you keeping today, Fiona? All well?
All very different to last week, Cathal, when we
Yeah.
were talking about the beautiful autumn morning, and we see what's after happening with the week and the challenging conditions we all have to deal with.
How things change so quickly. Lorraine, I think this is a really timely presentation that and we're going to have a chat this morning. I expect a good few questions because you're on to talk about the importance of climate adaptation on farms. And we said to you before we come, we talk a lot about weather here, and we've talked about droughts. Some parts of the country have droughts this year. Some parts have had a bumper year for grass growth. And now Storm Amy has arrived, and looking at some of the reports in Glengarriff and Cork, 107 mils of rain fell yesterday, which has wiped out roads, and we forget sometimes the farmers have to go out and work in those conditions afterwards, and the hardship and issues that it brings onto farms. Can we talk maybe a bit about that before we get going? That there's a lot in it.
There is a lot in it, and look, I definitely won't give you all the answers today, but this is kind of research that's a good starting point to start thinking more about these issues. So hopefully it'll be interesting for the crowd that we have today, and plenty of questions will come up in the Q&A session. So
Yeah,
yeah.
excellent. If you want to start sharing your presentation, and Lorraine, I just want to remind everyone that we are going to be recording today's session, so please do submit your questions to the Q&A tab. Fiona's going to look after questions, and Lorraine, it's a great opportunity to ask Lorraine anything that comes to your head in the middle of the presentation as well. So just to remind everybody, the podcast, the webinar is available on a podcast version, and it's available on all podcast platforms to listen to when you're out and about on the move. So Lorraine, I think that's good. You're good to go, so we'll let you on.
It's super. Thank you. So today the title of my presentation is Adapting to the Changing Climate, Farmers' Views and Strategies. So Cathal already introduced me, so I'm very happy to be delivering this talk today. And this is research that was funded by the EPA and commissioned actually by the CCAC, so the Climate Change Advisory Council of Ireland. So regarding the presentation outline, look, it'll be quite standard presentation here. So the introduction will just talk about the importance of climate adaptation and what it actually means. Regarding the context, I just want to remind everybody what the climate change projections are for Ireland. And then we'll talk about the methodology of this research and the results separated into multiple teams that are of importance in my view. And finally, some concluding remarks. So agriculture is increasingly exposed to climate change and its negative impacts. So here I'm going to cite some figures from an FAO study, so the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations. So they found in a study published in 2020 that the variability in temperature and rainfall is estimated to explain between 30 and 50% of the global interannual variability in cereal yields. And as you can imagine, this has massive impact on basically food security at a global scale. But if we bring it down at the farm level, which is going to be the topic of today's presentation, there are a lot of challenges that arise from climate change around farm operations and sustainability. And obviously, I'm not the only one who's talking about this. So if you look at media from, focusing on agriculture and farming in Ireland, you'll find that a lot of people talk about it. So this is an article here from the Farmers Journal in 2018 when we had this very severe drought. So there were loads of articles circulating around issues around farms. This article here is from the Irish Independent from last year, earlier this year, where we had this very big storm, the biggest storm that Ireland had experienced in a very long time, and that also caused significant challenges on farms. And then finally here, as a third example, this is actually also from the Irish Independent. This is an article from last year, I think, talking about issues around rainfall and floods on farms and how this was also making farmers' life quite difficult. So, you know, this is a very timely talk, and as you see, the weather outside also gives it a little bit more of importance today. So this is great. So in this context, climate adaptation is very important, and this notion of building more resilience to reduce climate impacts on farms and also think about vulnerability to future climate change. And I think it's useful to think about what climate adaptation actually means and separate it from the concept of climate mitigation. So climate adaptation basically gathers actions to adjust to actual or expected climate and its effects. So we're looking at how we can adapt to the current climate or future climate that we expect. And this is all to basically moderate harm or exploit beneficial opportunities that might also arise from climate change. And it stands in contrast with climate mitigation, which basically looks at actions to reduce emissions or enhance the sinks of greenhouse gases. So when we talk about climate mitigation, we look at how we can limit climate change, versus in climate adaptation, we look at how we can adapt to it. And both of these concepts actually work together, but today we'll talk specifically about climate adaptation. So in this context, climate adaptation has actually, come a little bit more to the forefront of public policy in the last 5 to 10 years. And this is despite the predominant focus that we see on climate mitigation. So I kind of expect a lot of people here to have heard a lot about climate mitigation, maybe a little bit less on climate adaptation, although more and more people are looking at that as well. But in reality, there's actually mixed progress in implementing the policies that are related to climate adaptation and in adaptation planning in general. And this is the case at the EU level for the agricultural sector as well as for Ireland. But in Ireland, what we have is a sectoral adaptation plan for agriculture, which was published in 2019, and it is currently being revised. It'll be updated by the end of this year. And this adaptation plan, in my view, is a very good starting point for the agricultural sector because it recognizes that we have an issue here that we need to look at and help farmers essentially to adapt better and build this resilience. But when you look at the document itself, there's actually quite limited information in terms of what farmers can actually do on their farms to adapt to climate change. And this brings us to the work that we are trying to do in the socioeconomic program that focuses on climate adaptation in Teagasc, which is essentially improve our understanding of how climate change can affect farmers and the type of actions that they can take to adapt to climate change. And the ultimate goal here is essentially to improve the supports that we have for farmers through, an integrated approach between policy design, research, and knowledge transfer. So coming to the objective of this study in more particularly, so essentially in this study, what we looked at is farmers' experience of climate change and the impacts that they were perceiving on their farms. And we also tried to identify the farm level strategies that farmers were implementing to adapt to climate change, as well as the factors that were affecting their implementation. So the study is actually an exploratory qualitative study. So what I mean here is that essentially we knew not a lot about the topic, and the idea was to go out and talk to farmers and hear what they had to say about it, so that this would be a good starting point to build a socioeconomic research program around climate adaptation. So the idea here is that we are not answering all questions. We were more trying to find the problems so that we would then be able to research them better and inform policy, knowledge transfer, and future research in Teagasc. So the study is actually part of a wider 10-month study that was a mixed method study. So mixed method meaning that we had this qualitative part of the study that was revolving more around interviews and focus groups, so kind of open discussions, let's say. Versus then a quantitative study that was led by other colleagues in the Rural Economy and Development Programme, and this was a larger scale survey, essentially. So the study was commissioned by the Irish Climate Change Advisory Council, as I said earlier, and they asked us to do this work to inform the development of the 2025 sectoral adaptation plan. So this work was actually presented earlier this year to the CCAC, so that they would think about how to incorporate some of our suggestions and recommendations then in the new plan. And as I mentioned, it's the start of a wider socioeconomic research program on climate adaptation. Oh yeah, and then you just have the on the right-hand side there, it's a screenshot of how the report looks like, but I have the references at the end in case people are interested, and I would encourage people to look at it because today it's kind of a very condensed version of the qualitative study, so there's more out there to read about, and then obviously there's the quantitative part as well, which is very interesting and can bring more insights to the table. So regarding the context, this is a bit of just a reminder for everybody in terms of what the climate change projections are for Ireland. So to look at this, you can look at Ireland's climate change assessment report that was published by the EPA in 2024, and they have a lot of information in terms of what the projections are. But for me, if I'm trying to summarize this, essentially, it's going to get wetter, warmer. There'll be greater variability as well, and an increase in extreme weather events. So this is kind of our starting point in terms of where we're going, and we're already experiencing some of that with today being a good representation of it. Okay, coming to the study itself, and specifically the methodology, I just want to talk a little bit about the study framing first. So obviously, before going out into the field, we knew that climate change was a very sensitive issue. And we were mindful also that there could be quite large differences in opinions from farmers, some farmers that felt quite concerned by it, some farmers that didn't feel concerned by it. And we wanted all of these farmers to be able to share these opinions and get them in a basically comfortable situation so that they would feel that they could express what they thought. So because of this reason, what we decided to do is implement an approach that was implemented in another study by the FAO. And essentially, the idea here was to focus in the terminology of the questions in the interviews on weather variability and extremes instead of climate change per se. And why we did this essentially goes back to the projections for Ireland. So in Ireland, climate change is resulting in greater variability and an increase in extreme events. And farmers experience these variations on a daily basis, while climate change actually occurs over an extended period of time. So what we wanted was for farmers to discuss changes in weather patterns and frequency of extreme events, talk about adaptation to their current situation, so what they were experiencing at the present, as opposed to talking about future climate. And we basically, in the interview, gave room to farmers to bring up climate change if they wanted to. And if farmers were to start talking about climate change, then myself as an interviewer, I would start talking about climate change and utilizing that terminology as well. So the idea was that we were reflecting their voices as opposed to my voice during the interview. And just to mention that the data was collected in 2024, and we are conscious that 2024 was a very wet year. So, you know, that could have influenced what farmers, their views essentially and perspectives. And we'll talk a little bit about this at the end of the presentation. So regarding the data collection itself, because it was a quite short study and it was meant to inform the adaptation plan, what we tried to do essentially is cover as much ground as possible in a very short period of time. So get a wide area of perspectives from farmers that were from different sectors, different regions, that were operating on different soil types, but also that were quite different in terms of their own profiles. So say age, for instance, gender. So we conducted essentially 9 semi-structured interviews. So what that means is basically a conversation with a farmer where we have quite open questions and then farmers get a chance to talk about the topics that we are interested in. And these topics were essentially weather change impacts, adaptation strategies, challenges that farmers were facing, and also if they were facing issues, what potential solutions they had identified or were thinking about for the future. So I have some little images there at the bottom of the slides that just shows you the representation of the sectors. So because I didn't have a lot of time to do the interviews, what I tried to do was to have some farmers that were quite specialized in a specific sector, but also have farmers that were coming from mixed farms, and that allowed to see also differences between the different sectors themselves. So we also collected data with advisors from Teagasc, and we ran one focus groups with Teagasc livestock advisors, and then we also did an interview with a Teagasc tillage advisor. And the questions there were about their understanding of climate adaptation, their role in supporting farmers in climate adaptation, and whether or not they felt they were prepared in fulfilling this role. So today I'm going to speak mainly about farmers, but I do have one slide to talk about the insights from the advisor's perspective, and I'll be quite explicit when it comes to that, so you'll be able to see what that brought also to the study. Okay, so regarding the data analysis, so the interviews range between 45 and 103 minutes, and the focus group was about 75 minutes. So essentially, we audio recorded, these interviews, and then we transcribed them into text. And what we did is conduct something called an inductive thematic analysis of the interview transcripts. So essentially, what that means is we read the transcripts and try to develop themes or see patterns in the data. So it's data driven in the sense that we don't come in with like preconceived ideas of what we're going to find in the data, but it's the data that tells us the story of what farmers are saying, essentially. And this was performed through the collaboration of two researchers, so myself and my colleague Sharon Sweeney. And why we did this essentially was to limit researchers' bias and support the reliability of data interpretations. So what I mean here is that both of us looked at the transcripts separately. We tried to identify these themes and patterns in the data, and then we did this work again together. And we had a lot of discussions, regarding the data, and we tried to make sure essentially that what I'm presenting today represents the farmer voices as opposed to what we think about the data. Okay, so I'll move on now to the results section and start first with the perceived experience of weather changes. And sorry, just to mention as well, what you'll see on my screen sometimes is green boxes with quotes, and those come directly from the interviews from farmers. So farmers talked about an increase in extreme weather events, and I have an example here from a tillage farmer that basically said there were beans in a field and that the bean seeds were washed onto the laneway, even if they were planted 4 inches deep because they had torrential rain. So I'm guessing it's quite a similar situation to what was experienced yesterday actually in Cork. And this farmer was basically saying that this type of rain was not something he had experienced much in the past, but that more and more he was seeing the rainfall come all at once, essentially. So they also spoke about atypical seasons. So this is a quote here from a sheep farmer who said, "Oh, summertime. What's summer anymore?" Because his feeling was that there was no change now between spring, summer, and autumn. So all the seasons were kind of blended together. And farmers expressed this idea that the weather changes they were experiencing were actually a fundamental shift that went beyond the typical weather variations that they had experienced in the past and managed in the past. And oftentimes then they associated those with climate change. So they started naturally talking about climate change. So because of these different weather changes that they were experiencing, they also talked about the impacts. And these impacts, I categorized them into 4 categories. So farm work, organization and management, and then the 3 dimensions of sustainability. So I'll take you through some examples here from the data. So regarding farm work, organization and management, farmers talked a lot about disruptions to the farming calendar. And this was essentially affecting a lot all the field operations. So the ability to spread slurry, to spray, to harvest, cut silage, all of these, where these tasks were essentially at times delayed on the farm. Land access and trafficability was an issue, and this also affected the ability to graze the land for livestock farmers. They also talked about pressure around infrastructure, so animal housing space could be an issue. So you have to think last year, so for instance, in the West, we had some farmers that had the animals in for 9 months and they weren't, the infrastructure weren't prepared to do this essentially. And this also caused issue around slurry storage. So we heard a lot about that actually in the media last year. Farmers also spoke about shorter windows of good weather to do these field operations, and this was particularly an issue for farmers that relied on contractors because contractors were under greater pressure to attend to all of their clients, and people could be kind of left stranded for a while because of this issue. So I have a quote here from a pig tillage farmer who said that the window for spreading slurry, the window for sowing crops was just getting shorter and shorter, and that as a result, they were having to spray more at night time sometimes when the weather was good, which meant that they were working both during the day and during the night and ending up with these very long days, which was then tougher going for the workers, essentially. Moving on now to the environmental dimension. So there were impacts on the soil in terms of soil waterlogging and flooding at times as well, damage to soil structure. So this was, for instance, through poaching or compaction. They also spoke about issues revolving around crops. So this was both for tillage crops as well as grass, issues around growth, the quality of these crops, and the capacity to utilize them then. They also talked about yield loss, so just crops not doing as well as they would normally do, in kind of more typical years. I had a farmer here that was actually from the Shannon Callows, so this is an area that is quite sensitive from an environmental standpoint, and he spoke about biodiversity loss because some of the land was being flooded, and this affected the ability to essentially preserve habitats that were important for certain species of birds. They also spoke about water quality around issues regarding slurry spreading, for instance, but they also spoke about this in terms of grazing. So, when animals are grazing out there and then suddenly there's torrential rain, so farmers were quite conscious that this wasn't an optimal situation in terms of water quality. Moving on to the economic dimension, they spoke about financial loss associated with these yield decreases. They also spoke about additional costs because when you're having a longer housing period, you're having to feed the animals indoor, and this was resulting in greater costs. The pig tillage farmer spoke specifically about the influence of, let's say, global climate change on grain prices. So what he was explaining essentially is that if there's some climate change impacts in areas of the world where the harvest and would basically dictate the price of certain grains globally, that this could have an effect also locally in Ireland, essentially, and for systems such as pig systems where they rely on grain quite a lot, this could increase volatility. And then one farmer also spoke about poor returns on rented land. So he was paying quite a good price to rent land, and then the land wasn't actually yielding the results that it was expected to because of poor grass growth. And as a result, this was causing some economic issues. So I just have a quote here from the Shannon Callows farmer who actually lost some land for silage and grazing, notably in 2023, but this was something that he was observing more and more in recent years. And as a result, he had to get fodder, and it was quite difficult to source that fodder. This is a quote that refers to the year 2023. And he had to buy a lot of stuff, and he owed a lot of money to the local merchant, and it took him over a year to square that up, which basically was very stressful. So he said that it frightened him what he owed that person for over a year. So following on from that, then are the social impacts, which relate to farmer well-being, for instance, worry, stress, and the additional workload that are caused with dealing with these weather changes. But they also spoke about this in terms of the farm worker perspective and issues around the farm worker well-being, as well as retention, notably on dairy farms. They also spoke about issues in terms of animal health and welfare. So this was related to, for instance, the heavy rainfall or the repeated rainfall over a long period of time during the grazing season, but also issues when we are having to extend the housing period as well. So the important idea here is that actually at the farm level, all of these impacts are interconnected, and farmers are very much aware of this, and they spoke about it in terms of knock-on effects. So when something goes wrong, it has knock-on effects on many other things on the farm. And this can be quite challenging because you're having this cascade of effects and you don't know where to start to stop it. But if we look at it from the opposite side of the coin, what we'll find is that if farmers find a way to adapt, the adaptation then can work through similar pathways because there are synergies, and it can help them then to basically improve their economic, social, and environmental situation. Okay, I'll move on to another theme that came up in the data, which was related to the need to adapt. So farmers actually, in my view, understood the situation and this need to adapt. And I have a quote here from a beef sheep farmer who said, "It's not going to help us if it continues this way. The way we farm would have to completely change. How, I don't know, but it's going to be very different." So this idea then that farmers did not always know what to do to adapt. But I guess what's interesting as well is that there were various views on how to approach it. And in my opinion, it reflects differences in the attitude of farmers towards risk and uncertainty. And I have two examples here from two dairy farms. The first dairy farmer was actually saying that he would just take it 1 year at the time, because he didn't want to make changes to the farm to plan for something that might happen in 10 years' time. And this was his current attitude. The other farmer actually was thinking more about the long term and the projections, so that we were going to get these drier spells, these wetter spells, and that we were going to have to think about changes. So he was speaking here specifically about multi-species swards and the need to mitigate against extreme weather, essentially. He's saying that a lot of farmers were obviously not thinking about this yet, but he was trying to get ahead of the curve and try things out by trying different mixes and kind of learning on how to manage this in the best way possible. Okay, I now want to talk more about farm level adaptation strategies, what came up from the interviews. So interviewees actually were already implementing many farm-level adaptation strategies, and some were aligned with Teagasc research and advisory, but I think they also mentioned some practices that were very interesting from their perspective and that I think could be more formally explored in the future in Teagasc, but also more broadly in the agri-food industry. So overall, these adaptation strategy aimed to reduce the impacts of adverse weather events. So that is what I call reactive practice. So say, for instance, it's raining very badly today, you run into the field and you bring the animals in. So that's what I would call reactive. But there's also a set of practices that are aimed to reduce vulnerability to future weather events. So these are the proactive practices. So how we are basically making changes today, so that tomorrow we don't get caught and we increase our preparedness. The practices that were implemented actually served multiple purposes on farms, including climate adaptation. But I think what is important here is that adaptation is not always the main driver of the decisions to adopt different practices. So there's other objectives such as, reduced workload, improved lifestyle, better business and things like that. So all of these decisions are essentially intertwined together, but there can be benefits coming from all of them, essentially, in terms of climate change adaptation. So another important point as well is that some of these practices were actually embedded in the farm routine. They were actually part of good farming management, and farmers were actually not always aware that what they were doing was actively adapting to climate change. And another point here is that actually there's a lot of factors that affect the decision to adopt these different adaptation practices. And I will not talk about everything, but I'm trying to highlight key ones in the next few slides. And if you're interested, you can look at the report. There's a lot more there. Okay, so these farm level adaptation strategies, I categorize them into different groups: grassland and pasture management, cropland management and cropping choices, livestock management, high nature value farmland, so stuff around planting trees and hedgerows here, for instance, capital infrastructure and equipment, what I called engineered solutions. So this was mainly related to drainage, risk management, and the redesign of current farming systems. So the first four relate actually to farm management. And in the interest of time, I've decided that I will only take a few examples in capital investments, risk management, and redesign of farming systems. Okay, so related to capital infrastructure and equipment, the objectives here for farmers were to reduce pressure on current infrastructure, when notably they were having to lengthen the housing period, and also to improve their work conditions and make things just a little bit easier around the farm. So these are some examples of what they were either implementing or considering. So the building of new or upgrading of current housing infrastructure, the building of slurry storage, and investment in machinery so that it would help them reduce their reliance on contractors. But to do all of this, there's actually some key factors that influence, the ability of farmers to actually engage in these type of practices. First one is economic viability, because here what we're talking about is some very costly measures. Farm succession plans as well. So if the farmer is middle-aged or maybe an older farmer and there is no clearly identified successor, engaging in such a large spending may not be that worthwhile. This is related then to farmer age and the time horizon that they have for their business. And finally, issues also around policy development. So, when schemes are available, it can make things a little bit easier. And they also spoke quite extensively on the dairy side about the nitrates directive. So essentially, potential changes to the nitrates directive can make people think twice about what they want to do. Sorry, so I just have a quote here, essentially to kind of talk a little bit more about this time horizon and age and succession issue and how that's all intertwined. So first of all, I have this derogation dairy farmer who was actually a young farmer, and he said that he had a clear path, that him and his partner were going to be there for the next hopefully 30 or 40 years, and that the new slurry storage was going to be a long-term investment, and that they were confident to do this. And this stood in contrast with the beef sheep farmer, who was actually a middle-aged farmer, who said she wouldn't actually consider putting that kind of money into new slurry storage because she didn't know if any of the kids were going to be into farming, and it would all just be sitting there, essentially. So another point that is important when we think about these capital infrastructures is the issue of what I call path dependency. So infrastructure and animal numbers are interlinked together. So you build the infrastructure, or you consider it because you have a certain number of animals that you're basically operating on the farm. And these capital investments actually have long-term financial implications. So the issue then is that farmers kind of get locked in at a certain level of intensity, essentially. So I think there's kind of two quotes here that are useful to understand this idea. The first one is from a beef farmer who said that if there was another few years like the one that we experienced last year, you'd be seriously questioning yourself, that investing in more sheds would maybe not be the wisest thing to do, and that less might be more in terms of having maybe less cattle on the farm. And this stood in contrast with, for instance, the derogation dairy farmer who had already done a lot of investment and said that he didn't want to cut the numbers because they had so much facility and investment made already, and that they couldn't actually cut those numbers because this was going to cause issues in terms of the financial implications on the farm. So while the capital infrastructure can be an interesting adaptation strategy, there's also some issues there in terms of those long-term effects. Okay, moving on to risk management here as an example of adaptation strategies. Farmers actually thought about how they could produce a little bit more fodder to essentially build their fodder reserve or buffer feed during the year. And if they didn't have the capacity to produce it, they could purchase it. So for some farmers then, what they mention is the cropping contracts that they could have with, say, tillage farmers. So this was mentioned specifically by livestock farmers as opposed to tillage farmers, and how that can give them some level of security in terms of the amount of fodder that they're going to get for the winter. Another thing that farmers were doing is essentially lowering the animal stock before winter, so that it would reduce the cost over the winter by selling some animals essentially in the kind of the autumn time. And then finally, some of the farmers also engaged in the practice of preparing business plans that would account better for volatility, both in terms of weather and in price, so that they would kind of test the system and ensure that they could actually cope with these changes. So what triggered essentially learning and adaptation in this area was mainly the previous experience of weather impacts. So this idea that, you get cut once and you kind of think about how you're going to reduce your vulnerability going forward. And I just have a quote here from a beef farmer who said that he was trying to make more fodder because of the unknown. And that essentially he needed a certain amount of extra feed, that every year what he was thinking he would need, he would actually add 3 months of extra feed. And that is what would constitute then his fodder reserve. Okay, moving on to the idea of the redesign of current farming systems. So in the data, what we saw is that there was already some system changes observed on a few farms with what I would call small adjustment. So this would be, for instance, the move from suckler beef to dairy beef systems, or for instance, the move from suckler to dairy heifer contract rearing. So the idea here is that you're still operating, with cattle. You already have the infrastructure, but you're just making some changes to try to basically make things maybe a little bit easier or get more regular paychecks or things like this. But we also saw a farmer who was actually a milk sheep farmer do kind of a more transformative change. And for this farmer, what he decided to do essentially was move away from the low-cost grass-based system model to a more indoor-outdoor system. And what he said in the interview was that grass would only represent about 60% of the diet. And to do this, he basically made changes in all areas of farm operations and management, and this involved long-term investments, but he highlighted that he was able to do it because he was operating a dairy system that was economically viable and that was quite intensive, so it would actually generate the revenue that would be needed to basically repay these investments. So here are some quotes of the reasons why he did it. So he felt like he wanted to move away from the dependence or the exposure to this weather variability, and that in his view, resilience was not the grass-only model, the low-cost model, but that he preferred to essentially have a higher input system where he would have a more stable income over time. And what I think is interesting is if you look at figures, say for instance, from the Teagasc National Farm Survey in kind of dairy systems, but these would be kind of more dairy cattle systems, you'll find that a lot of farmers already have only about 60% of the diet coming from grass. So I think that there are some farmers who are already operating a little bit of these systems without actually expressing it as explicitly as what this person was doing. Okay, so talking now about pathways towards climate adaptation and specifically farmer supports to help them adapt to this changing climate. So farmers talked about financial support and the importance of these financial supports in terms of the further support schemes that we have at times. They also spoke about agri-environmental schemes such as acres to help them improve the landscape around their farms and how this could also have benefits from an adaptation perspective. They spoke about TAMS grants and how this could also help them to basically invest in the farm in terms of infrastructure. But they also highlighted that this was not always sufficient for farmers that were a little bit more socioeconomically vulnerable. So in the case of this research, it was maybe more mixed systems or systems such as beef systems. So then thinking about supports in the space of advisory and social supports, there was a lot of support that came from their peers. And this was within and outside what I would call the institutional frame of advisory services. So they had their discussion groups, but they also had, their neighbors that they have a quick chat and when they run into each other, and that also helps them in terms of social support. Discussion groups were also mentioned quite extensively and how it could help farmers discuss the issues of adaptation from a technical perspective, but also, help them feel a little bit better when they were feeling a little bit down because of issues around weather variability. Farmers spoke also about joint programs, but this was mainly on the dairy side. And finally, something that I think was quite important, they also said that, group extension and discussion groups are great, but sometimes you need the one-to-one advice. And this is notably when we're talking about what I would say are the multifunctional practices or the ones that are more spatially sensitive. So where do I plant my hedgerow? Where do I plant my tree so that I can get all the benefits from it in terms of shadow for the animals going forwards during droughts or fighting against the wind, there's things like that, while at the same time, having maybe water quality benefits or carbon sequestration, things like that. Finally, farmers also spoke about cooperation among farmers, and this was important for the exchange of feed supplies in years where things were a little bit difficult. But they also said that there could be competition for these resources. And this was the case for land, for feed, for straw. And we did observe some important regional differences there, notably between the West and the South, for instance. But all of this needs to be analysed more in the future, because again, this was just this exploratory study with just a few farmers being interviewed. Okay, so this is the part where I speak about advisors. So when we spoke with advisors, what advisors said is that the toolbox in terms of the climate adaptation toolbox was actually quite limited, because the predominant focus in recent years had been on climate mitigation, how to reduce emissions. And so they didn't have a lot of practices to suggest to farmers to basically adapt to climate change. They also said that they had a quite heavy workload, and it meant that they had a limited amount of time that they could use to engage with climate adaptation, which made it a little bit more difficult for them. And they also said that in recent years, there had been a lot of changes in policies, which resulted in kind of mixed messages. And this had an effect in terms of causing fatigue for both advisors and farmers, and made it more difficult to keep up with what was going on and give the best advice to their clients. But overall, they had the appetite to learn more about this so that they would improve the delivery of services for farmers. And this was something that they knew, that climate change was going to become increasingly important and needed to be looked at more. Okay, so we're back here to the farmer perspectives. And I want to talk a little bit more about the design of future production systems. So towards the end of the interviews, we did ask farmers what they thought about the future and how they saw all of this issue unfold. And overall, they identified few opportunities coming with climate change, but there were a few things that were mentioned and that I think are interesting to talk about today. So first of all, they talked about opportunities for cross-country learning. So overall, farmers were conscious that production systems were being displaced. So what I mean here is that, some areas of the world are experiencing a new climate, and that essentially there might be opportunities there to have discussions with people in other countries to understand what it is that they're doing, or also to talk to farmers that experienced a similar climate to our future climate. They also spoke about new crop species and variety, and in this sense, recognized the importance of having research trials that could advance our level of knowledge before being rolled out on commercial farms. And then finally, there was mentions here of market opportunities due to global climate change. So essentially, the idea here is that even if climate change challenges our local conditions, potentially there's much worse situations out there in other regions of the world, which means that climate change is essentially limiting the production of certain commodities in areas of the world that are currently competitive for these specific commodities, and where there's a quite large demand for these products. And what this means is that essentially there could be opportunities in terms of new markets and new commodities for Ireland. And the example that we had in the data was from sheep milk, essentially. So moving on to my concluding remarks, you'll be happy to know that we're almost done. So overall, the study participants were basically perceiving the impacts of climate change on their farms. And as a result, they were implementing farm-level adaptation strategies to basically cope with this. But they mentioned the need to have additional supports. And I think what's interesting is that we already have a lot of channels in place, but climate adaptation essentially needs to become a larger priority in policy, in research, and in knowledge transfer, so that we utilize these channels better for this specific topic. And it's worthwhile to mention that this is already happening. So climate adaptation is one of the pillars of the Teagasc Climate Centre. And we also have the Signpost program, which basically helps farmers both in terms of mitigation as well as adaptation. There's also an opportunity to strengthen the climate adaptation strategy at the policy level and to better coordinate the agri-food industry and farmers. So ultimately, we are trying to increase preparedness to current and future climate. And again, this is where this work came from to try to provide some recommendations for the new adaptation plan. And we can find solutions if we work together more and we work specifically with our farmers. So it needs to be very farmer-centric, essentially. So I think there's a lot of questions that remain, and some of them are specifically for farmers that are in difficult socioeconomic contexts related to poor economic viability and issues around generational renewal. And we can ask ourselves the question of whether current supports are actually sufficient to enable climate adaptation on these farms. There's also issues for farmers that are in environmental sensitive contexts. So for instance, in this data, we had the Shannon Callis farmer, but it would need to be complemented by more information from coastal farmers maybe, or farmers in catchment areas. And my thinking here is that the farm level adaptation strategies may not fully apply for these farmers because they're embedded in a wider context, and we may need to have wider landscape or regional approaches here with a better basically a collective approach to this. And the issue here is that this may involve multiple actors, not only people from the agricultural sector, but also other sectors, such as flood management maybe, and water quality, etc. Climate adaptation under risk and uncertainty. I mean, you understood this was also a topic of concern here. So climate change is obviously an obvious stressor on farms, but there's also issues around the current policy landscape and changes in the policy, global inflation, and this makes things, even more difficult for farmers. And the question here is, are some farmers or maybe some sectors better equipped than others to deal with this and adapt? And the objective here is to continue investigating this in the future. Finally, there's also future opportunities for our sector, and I spoke a little bit about that. And I think here it's worthwhile to say again, the data was collected in 2024, so farmers were being quite negative about what was happening. And the question here is, what about good years? Maybe farmers would have thought about this differently. So there's much more to come in this area. Stay tuned. Hopefully in the next few months and years, we'll have more to share about this. So thank you very much for your attention. I just want to highlight that you can read the report. We also have a T-Research article that was published here with my colleagues in the REDP program. And I just want to acknowledge the contribution of my co-authors, our funders, and also all of our research participants. Thank you.
Lorraine, that was excellent. Thanks a million. You're after opening up a can of worms and questions here. I think there's so much to talk about. But I won't delay too long because Fiona, I know there's lots of questions coming in here, but there's a question I have, and there's a couple of questions that comes in that I might gather some of them as well. But so we talked about changing climates, and some of the farmers' opinions are, looking at mitigation measures, which we have lots of mitigation measures. Our advisors, our programs are trying to deliver that would help to adapt farms for climate change, which is great. We've big programs in place and really good technologies and measures. I'm a little bit concerned sometimes that some farmers may have a knee-jerk reaction, say, for example, from going from something like a grass-based system, which is low cost, which Ireland is renowned for, all the way over to an indoor system, which it may look better on paper in the short term, but another one of your pig farmers suggested that external global prices are volatile and we can't control them. And if you have 40% of feed being imported farm, that can be something we can do now that in the short term looks really good, might be very, very negative. So I'm a bit concerned that that's number one. And another kind of a point came up on one of the questions. So if we're talking about food and importing food, if we're obviously we want to stay with grass-based system, it's the way to go for us. But if we did that, what will happen, or where does that go, or should we be growing more grains in our country maybe to be resilient against that?
Yeah. So regarding your first question about the move towards more maybe indoor systems or indoor systems, I mean, I agree with you. First of all, we don't have the research done in Teagasc to basically support what this farmer was doing. I think for me, the learning from it was that he was embracing a little bit more this idea that he was under pressure with grass at times and that he wanted to be better prepared for it. Whereas what I find is that, with this research, there were farmers that essentially had the animals in for 9 months last year. And not only not last year, in the last few years, they observed this lengthening of the housing period, which meant that their infrastructure wasn't at all adapted to it. So I think what we can learn from this other farmer was that he was trying to adapt the housing infrastructure and the fodder reserves to the situation, So I wouldn't say we need to move towards these indoor systems. I just think that we need to be better prepared in terms of the pressure that can come from a lengthening of the housing period, which we're going to experience, in the future. There'll be very good years and there might be some very bad years as well. And we just need to be prepared for that. So that's the take that I I take on this the opinion of this farmer. And again, when you look at the data in the Teagasc NFS, you'll find that a lot of farmers actually have only about 60% of the cow diet that comes from grass. So there's also already a lot of farmers that are, complementing the diet with other types of fodder or concentrate feed. So I think it is already happening a little bit. This is just that if we're a little bit more upfront about it, I think we can be better prepared for it, is my view. And your second question, sorry, Carl, I actually wrote down only the first one.
Yeah,
It was about the
just
grain, the need for more grain.
well, if I and
Yeah,
I know
look,
like yeah.
yeah, look,
Wait, sorry, go on.
sorry, yeah, I think from the research, I was wondering if one of the outcomes of this research is that tillage farmers are a little bit more vulnerable than livestock farmers. But I think that we don't have enough data yet to say that. And this is part of some work now that I'm doing with a PhD student using a larger data set to try to understand a little bit more the differences between the sectors. So I'd say, so that's one thing. The second thing is that there's been a decrease in the amount of tillage farmers in the country, also because of the difference in profitability with the dairy systems and competition for land and things like that. So I think that we've seen a reduction. I mean, this is a sector that's a little bit under pressure. And personally, I think it would be no harm in growing more grain in Ireland, because when you're depending on other countries to provide that grain and they might be experiencing climate change as well, it's also putting us in a situation that is a bit uncomfortable. So yeah, so that would be my thinking. I'm not sure it would affect the prices though, because the prices of grains are not set. We're a very small player, so this may just affect the supply as opposed to the price, if you know what I mean, Carl.
Yeah, no, lots of questions, Fiona.
There are, Lorraine, and I'm going to start off with one comment we made ourselves this morning. The media and ourselves focus a lot on climate change during extreme weather events, say like we're experiencing now. But do we tend to lose interest, or did your farmers acknowledge that they tend to lose interest when normal conditions are resumed? Is it just a topic that they visit when they are challenged by these, or was there any take on that from them?
Yeah, I think this was acknowledged by farmers. One of them then even spoke about the fact that actually, there's the very bad years, say every 5 years, but that there are smaller extremes in between, which I thought was an interesting way to look at, where you could have a drought for, say, I don't know, a week maybe, or a drier spell, let's call it, for a week or so, where they're having to maybe buffer feed with a bit of silage, but then you forget about it because it was maybe a few bales and nothing that caused a major panic on the farm. So I think you're absolutely right. People tend to lose a little bit of interest when we forget about it, and maybe it's a good thing as well, because it is a quite stressful issue. But that being said, because of the increase in the frequency of it and this notion around these atypical seasons as well, where it's not really an extreme, but it's kind of this notion that seasons are kind of blending together. I think farmers are becoming more and more aware that they need to have a better fodder reserve. These practices that are essentially good farm management, I think, they're a little bit more conscious of it. Coming from this study, again, we would need larger numbers to verify that. And I should look again at the findings from the quantitative part of the report. I think for some of that it was looked at as well, as part of
That
one of the
leads
studies.
very well into the next question, Lorraine, which is about the numbers that you used. And I think you said it was you're really looking at quantitative rather than qualitative. Can you comment on that, because that was an interesting concept that was a few questions on.
Yeah, so look, I mean, the goal of the qualitative research is that you have an open discussion with the farmer, that the farmer can basically lead that discussion where he or she wants to go, and you can basically explore topics really in depth. You're going to be talking for an hour and a half with a farmer, whereas when you do a survey, it's going to be a 5-minute survey where the questions are already defined by the researcher. So, even if we try to do surveys in the best way possible, the way we phrase them are going to influence the interpretation of the farmer. Whereas in the qualitative side, it is much more open. So I think it's respects more the voice of the farmer. And for me, it's something really important to do when we're trying to learn about a topic where we don't know anything about, and this was very much the case for climate adaptation, in my view. Like we weren't ready to do a very good, very, very good survey work. We did a survey that, in fairness, was I think taught us a lot. And you can look at the report for that. But the questions were prepared by ourselves with our limited knowledge of the topic. So more, if we had more time, we would have probably first started with the qualitative and then formulate questions for a survey. But because it was a 10-month study, it was all done.
Right.
In parallel. So yeah, I hope this answers the question, Fiona. Yeah.
No, it does, and you've kind of led into the next one when you've mentioned their adaptation, because a number of times it was raised in the questions: are we looking at mitigation or adaptation, or can we do both at the same time?
Yeah.
But from your point of view with this survey, it was really it was the farmer attitude and awareness of adaptation and more so than mitigation. Is that correct?
Yeah. So we tried. I mean, we focused only on adaptation, but what you will find is that there are some practices that overlap between both. So, for instance, in terms of carbon sequestration, to plant hedgerows and trees, that's going to have a benefit, in terms of providing shade to your cows or maybe protecting them from the elements, but it also helps with carbon sequestration. So there can be an overlap. And I think the idea here is to try to identify those synergies so that we're able to deliver advice in terms of these synergies. But I think something that is important also is to recognize that there may also be trade-offs, and we need to look at those as well. So, sometimes I'm trying to think like we're trying to say, for instance, reduce the age at finishing. So what that means, in my view, and maybe I have a simple understanding of it, but you're trying to breed for cattle that would be growing very fast or be quite strong, let's say. This is, again, the view of the economist about this. And this is in terms of mitigation. But from an adaptation perspective, this type of animals may not be suitable at all for certain farmers. And maybe some of those that operate on heavy soils, these animals are too heavy, and so I did speak to a farmer who was moving to dairy beef because he felt in the context of climate change these animals were actually better suited for his soil type. So then they can be a bit of a trade-off, and I think we need to analyze that more going forward. Yeah.
Very last quick question, because I'm sure Cathal will hold me up if I stay going. But there is you identified, farmers said they understood the need to adapt, but sometimes they weren't sure on how to do that. So quick comment on how professionals like advisors, how they're best, what should they do to I suppose encourage that, fill that gap, or how can they assist in filling that gap with farmers?
Yeah, I think a lot of this has to do with communication. So I think if you look at let's take the example of the mitigation pathway that we have in Teagasc. We have the MAC curve. It's very clear. We know what to say to farmers. It's there. It's been communicated clearly. On the adaptation side, if you type climate adaptation, you don't have a list of actions there that advisors can pull from to give advice, in various situations. It doesn't mean there's no information at all, because obviously we already talk about fodder reserves, we already talk about slurry storage, all of that, but it's maybe not communicated in a way that we understand this is in the best way possible. And again, if you look at the example of mitigation, you see the contrast there. So advisors absolutely have roles. But what I would say is that we also need to work on the future climate. And I think this is where maybe research together with our farmers and our advisors can try to find solutions as well. So what we have at the minute is very much focus on the current situation and the dealing with the impacts. It's a bit reactive. That's what I mean. So if you want to be more proactive, we'll have to expand that toolbox, in my view, going forward.
And
Perfect.
you're right, Fiona, we are just out of time, but and I know we'll go a minute or two over, but I have one additional question to add to that, Lorraine, because I think it's an
Hmm.
important one. So you mentioned Mac Curve, and we have like signpost programs, we have biodiversity water quality programs, we have lots of really good information, research, really good advisory information coming out. Did you get a sense from the farmers that they identified that there is obviously problems on their farms, and that's associated with climate change? And we have technologies in place, but I suppose did it come across that the technology and devices there, how willing are they to put it in place on the farm? That change management piece, we have solutions, but are they willing
Yeah.
to get it to adapt it quickly on the farm rather than pushing it out?
Hmm. Well, I think, Carl, that's where we also need to separate the mitigation from the adaptation. So, in mitigate, when you talk about mitigation, you're really talking about something that is for the greater good in a way. So it has a public benefit in terms of reducing emissions. Sometimes it can be cost neutral or cost efficient. We do have practices like that, but you're still talking about something that you're calling the side of the farmer that is about the public, it's public facing, you know what I mean? Because in adaptation, what you're talking about is something that is very much private. I mean, it's about your business, how to cope with things that affect you directly. And I think in the communication piece, it's quite different, one versus the other. So my sense, and again, this is not backed by data because we do need to do that work, is that in the adaptation piece, farmers are a little bit more worried, maybe a little bit more ready to willing to have these conversations. Not saying that they're not in that mitigation side, because we obviously have farmers that do a lot in that space as well. But I suppose it's just this public versus private benefit that is it's quite natural in human nature, isn't it? So yeah, I hope that helps a little bit, Carl. And then obviously they're still facing barriers, which I talked a little bit about in the presentation. But it's about identifying those and trying to improve support so that they can overcome them more easily, let's say, going forward. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's an important way to finish. And you mentioned in your presentation as well that, some people were a little bit afraid to put measures in place because they don't know what's going to happen. But at the
Yeah.
same time, we talk a lot about generational renewal and the next generation coming on to take over our farms. And I suppose if we don't put stuff in place, the next generation won't be as quick to come in. So we have to bear that in mind as well. So
Yeah.
we need to think of the people coming after us too. Yeah. So
Hmm.
unfortunately, Rain, we're out of time, but that
Hmm.
was a really interesting presentation. I think we're going to have to bring you back on again at a later stage because there's a lot more
Hmm.
to talk about. And apologies to everyone, we didn't get through all the questions. A lot came in, but Fiona, you did a great job, and
Hmm.
we got through a lot of them. But Lorraine, thank you very much. That was an
Super. Yeah.
excellent presentation and certainly eye-opening to think what's coming up for us anyway. I just want to thank you, Fiona, for
Great.
questions, and also like to thank Yvonne Mar for all your help in the background in running the show. And next week, we can look forward to Teagasc Catchment Co-ordinator for the Blackwater, Dr. Philip Murphy, and we'll discuss targeting water quality actions in catchments of concern. That's a very important message for improving our water quality, and it's not to be missed. So do tune in again next Friday at 9:30. But until then, I hope you have a great weekend, and hopefully you don't get washed out and the weather improves a little bit. With that, slán go fóill.